the only party that's talking about good jobs for middle-class Americans and placing that at the center are Republicans.
Well, do you think the Democrats' problem was mainly one of messaging or of needing to change the substantive policy stances?
It's a great question and an important one. I think it was both.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary. This week, the white working class overcoming class cluelessness in America. I'm speaking with author Joan Williams about her new book that is being called a must-read for blue state residents. So welcome to the Contrary.
Delighted to be here, Bonnie. I've admired your work for a long time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, you wrote this book in response to last year's election.
I did.
Why?
Well, I came home from an election night party, just panicked, as I think a lot of people were. And I had written a book on class in 2010 to Crashing Silence. And then I thought, I just have to speak out on these issues. Everything that I hold dear is being jeopardized by progressives' failure to really understand and connect with the white working class.
Progressives did, after all, run the Occupy Wall Street movement. Was that not something that appealed to the white lower middle class?
No, not really. The white working class, by which you're right, we're really talking about the middle class here, the 53%. That's who I'm focused on. And whites in the middle, they actually admire the wealthy quite a bit. The people they resent are professionals, kind of the likes of us. And the reason they do is that the dream that really captures people who have been order takers their whole life is to be order givers. You're fired. It's not to be a law professor. I mean, I'm just like a Martian. My way of life is so different. I've run my life completely differently. What they want is to keep the culture that they grew up in, preferably in the area they grew up in, and just have more money. That's why they really admire the rich and resent professionals.
Okay, and what did Donald Trump's election do to women's rights in your view?
It's been terrible. It's been terrible for women's rights. It's been terrible for all the issues that I've worked for my entire life.
How so?
Well, I mean, just in a very concrete way, one of the things the Obama administration had done is upped the wages of people who have to be paid overtime, and I'm a workers' rights person. That was an incredible workers' rights victory. It's now gone. Another thing that Obama administration's DOL did, the Department of Labor, was imposed fiduciary obligations of care to financial advisors, giving people advice for their retirement plans. That too is probably gone. A lot of the things that, I mean, in terms of, I don't think it's helping women to have a president who boasted in public about sexual assault. A lot of the gender equality projects and even the equality regulations through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a lot of the information to help people exercise their rights is gone from the EEOC's webpage. This is a very serious setback for everything I care about.
And what's your prescription moving forward?
I think that elites, especially, I'm concerned, I think this is equally true of all elites, but I'm especially concerned with progressive elites. I think we need to understand where the white working class is coming from and stop caricaturing them and writing them off as just racist, sexist, deplorable, beneath our notice. I think that is First of all, it's not a Clinton problem, because Obama had the same problem when he wrote these people off as bitter people clinging to guns and religion. I think it's really a failure of the social imagination of people who have been committed to equality projects their whole lives, but have forgotten that one of the important equality projects has to do with class disadvantage. And class differences, these economic differences, are expressed through cultural differences. That's the way class differences are expressed. So when we assume as progressives that anyone who holds traditional values is just ignorant, what we're doing basically is saying these are people to whom we have not offered elite lives, but we want them to be just like us, those of us who have lived elite lives. That is inconsistent with our values and basically fundamentally beneath us.
Well, do you think the Democrats' problem was mainly one of messaging or of needing to change the substantive policy stances?
I think it's a great question and an important one. I think it was both. I think an example of the failure of messaging is take the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Obama, bless his heart, could not stop talking about the insurance he was newly going to get for the $20 million. He talked about it as a means-tested program targeted on the poor. There's a long history that shows that means-tested programs trigger class conflict. Why? Because if you're just above, you get nothing. Obamacare was also a universal program, and that is what had very broad appeal, as we're now seeing, because of it's very controversial, because of the two aspects of it that were universal, the prohibition of pre-existing condition exclusions and keeping your kids till they were age 26 on your insurance. Both of those are very, very popular. And so Democrats had a universal program that they messaged as a means-tested program, thereby making Obamacare extremely unpopular. And so that's a good example of how Democrats have done a very poor job at messaging. But they also need to change what they're advocating from a substantive point of view, because, you know, it's just a little crazy. The only party that's talking about good jobs for middle-class Americans and placing that at the center are Republicans. And Democrats should be saying that there's been a hollowing out of the middle class, and therefore we're going to take positive action, not through social programs, not by expanding social programs, but by building a new education to employment system that is going to train people for middle skill jobs. Democrats have tended to talk about college. I've been a professor since I was 28 years old. I'm not against college or increasing access to college, but you know what? 2/3 of Americans do not have college degrees. And to say to them, I guess you don't care about your future, well, we've just seen what happens.
Aren't the data even from the perspective of people who want a lot of people to go to college, aren't they worse than that, in the sense that I thought it was that 1/3 of Americans start college. That does not mean they get college degrees. It means they start possibly at a community college, possibly they don't, and they don't get their 2-year degrees, they don't get their 4-year degrees. It doesn't mean that they all complete college, does it?
No, I mean, well, the data point I have is that 2/3 of Americans are not college graduates. But you're right. One of the reasons that working class kids don't go to college, well, some of them just don't want to be pencil pushers. That's just not their goal. But going to college is far riskier from a financial standpoint for a working class kid than it is for someone from a professional family. And it's harder to get in, it's harder to stay in. You have to face things like the white trash bash. In other words, you have to face parties where your people are called garbage. And a lot of them end up dropping out. And so there are a lot of people who start college, have huge college loans, and they don't graduate. So they're paying back those huge college loans on the income of a high school graduate, often paying like a third of their income for college debt with no benefit. That's a very risky proposition.
Now, so you say this is what elites don't know about middle and middle-income white voters who presumably went for Trump because he did win 53% of the white vote. So with elites now knowing this, let's say they've read your book and they understand, how is that going to change things? Are they supposed to all of a sudden care about a demographic that they really haven't paid much attention to?
I think they should care, and I mean, the book is designed for anyone who was surprised that Trump won. It's designed to explain to them, here's why Trump won, here's what we have to do to turn that around. And I think that there's a couple things that are really important. First of all, when progressive elites had a very robust coalition with the working class, it's when economic issues were at the center. And these economic issues, not minimum wage, that's an issue for the bottom 30%, for the poor. They're very important, but they're a different group. But for this middle 53% of Americans, they don't want social programs. They want a good job that yields a modest middle-class standard of living. And so the only party that's talking to them now is Republicans, of like, we're going to get you those jobs through coal. Well, that's a fiction. We're going to get you those jobs through supply-side economics, which is going to create jobs for all. That's a fiction. But what do we say in response? We say, we don't like Donald Trump. That's not an answer. We have to be saying, we hear you. We hear what you care about. Middle-income people of all races, we want you to have good jobs. And we're going to create an education to employment system to train you. And it's going to be good for the economy because there's a well-documented lack of American workers trained for these middle-skill jobs. In some areas of the country now, the construction boom is being constrained by the lack of plumbers. Well, if we would stop talking about plumber's butt and other ways, other insulting ways of talking about important work, maybe we wouldn't have that problem.
There are one or two very controversial issues you haven't touched on here, which is from the perspective of a journalist who watched Trump's candidacy really get on a roll. His first issue was immigration. And it could be perceived that middle and lower middle white Americans see all the attention that the Democrats paid to diversity and to people, people of color, and they, without making the money and without having the college degrees or even wanting that, as you say, as a lifestyle, watching this, were any of them saying, well, what about me? Don't I matter? And when Trump started talking about limiting immigration, that's what got them to look seriously at Donald Trump as a candidate?
I think there's certainly a lot going on here, and I don't apologize for racism, sexism, homophobia from the white working class or anyone else. That should be very, very clear. On the other hand, I think there's been a very convenient tendency on the part of white elites to write off the economic concerns of non-elite whites on the grounds that those other whites are racist. There's something off there. The fact is that the professional elite tends to, their social honor comes from merit. And so they stereotype African Americans as lower in merit. There are 40 years of studies that show that. Middle class whites, their social honor comes from seeing themselves as moral people. And so they stereotype African Americans as being less moral. I think there's plenty of blame for racism to go around in this country. And I think for elites to displace their guilt over racism onto other class whites is really inappropriate.
But let's get away from racism for a moment. The problems that a lot of middle or lower middle income whites are having getting ahead in the world, keeping jobs, competing against lower wage immigrant workers, for example, in the construction industry that you talk about. I spend a lot of time in a rural county outside of Washington, D.C., and I know a lot of these people, and they feel like they're being left behind, and immigrants are getting ahead of them. And this has nothing to do with racism. It has to do with, you know, what's going on in this country and who in certain ways is getting promoted, who in certain ways is getting more jobs, and who isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated because, of course, a lot of the immigrants to the United States are doing jobs that no native-born American wants to do. And I think that that's often missed in the immigration debate. I also think, though, that one of the things that elites often don't understand is that working class whites are very proud of being Americans. And they really value continuity and stability, whereas more privileged whites, they're not as nationalistic. Every social group tends to stress the social categories that they belong to that are high in status. And so if you're a working class white, being American is one of those high status categories. If you're at the top of the heap in the United States, you don't need to stress being American. You're at the top of the heap. That's what you're focused on. And so I think the reasons that immigration resonates as an issue, there are a lot of them. I think that nationalism is part of it. I think that racism is sometimes part of it. In one particular race, Eric Cantor's really shocking defeat, immigration played a central role. And if you go back and look at what the purchase was, he was talking about amnesty, in other words, immigration reform, as robbing Americans of jobs. If you don't place at the center the fact that middle-class people want middle-class jobs, and this is a central tenet of the Democratic Party to give it to them, then those economic anxieties will come out in uglier ways.
Religion. How does religion play into all this?
You know, I think, unfortunately, I'm a San Francisco progressive. I mean, I'm a born caricature. So I think many in my crowd just see anyone who believes in God as kind of intellectually pathetic. I think that is a widespread form of social snobbery. In my circles, you know, we're into artisanal, whether it's artisanal coffee or artisanal religion or artisanal sexualities. That is an elite taste. You need high human capital to do that. So among people of more modest educational backgrounds, they don't value novelty. They don't value that form of active, constant self-invention. They value stability. They value tradition. This is an expression of their place in the social hierarchy. And I think that in many ways, unselfconsciously, elite people say to unelite people, we haven't given you elite lives, but we want you to be just like us with our elite values. That does not make sense, and it won't work.
President Trump went very strongly after the Christian evangelical vote. Is this the group we're talking about right now, that you're talking about?
I'm talking about a much broader group. I'm talking about a much broader group of Americans, and this is actually not just the white middle class. This is African Americans even more so. They have a lot of allegiance to traditional religion, to traditional gender roles, to what they see as traditional family values. And I think that elites need to understand more respectfully of why all of those values make sense to those people in terms of the lives they lead, rather than just seeing all of those as just a caricature, sometimes the beliefs of ignorant peasants.
You talk in the book about working class women being less interested in women's empowerment than, as you say, elites. Explain that.
I think that when Hillary Clinton talked about breaking the glass ceiling, what does that mean? That means the likes of us get to have the same jobs as our husbands or male partners had. Why should they care in the middle class? They don't. They don't care about that.
They don't care if they're teachers, for example, making the same wage as male teachers.
I'm talking about
if they were construction, which many women are trying to break into. First of all, being allowed to work those jobs, and secondly, making what the men make when they work them.
I'm not saying they don't care about equal pay. They do. I'm talking about the glass ceiling metaphor, which is a metaphor for women getting high elite professional jobs. That does not connect with working class women. Sexual harassment might have, right? A lot of them experience sexual harassment every day of the week, whether they're in pink-collar jobs or blue-collar jobs. And so I think the Hollywood tapes represented an amazing opportunity to connect with working class women, but it wasn't taken. All we heard about was the glass ceiling. And so I think that, so that's one, it was just a misstep, I think, a dropped stitch, which is another example of how among progressives, our failure to understand these people in their own shoes, where they are, is really, really hurting us.
There are reports that some young women, college educated mainly, I would think, but also even Republican women, are embracing the term feminist nowadays. What role did that play in the 2016 election?
The attraction to the word feminism, which has been often had a fragile hold, even among college-educated women, has traditionally been less among women who are not college graduates. And one of the reasons is that the breadwinner homemaker family still holds a lot of allure in this context. First of all, a lot of the women have pink-collar, low-wage jobs. And so they really look back with yearning onto the context where they had partners who had solid middle-class, blue-collar jobs that could bring the family up to a solid middle-class standard of living. The other thing is that you often have, particularly among the middle class, the way they handle having two jobs is they can't pay for decent childcare, and so they tag team, where mom works one shift and dad works a different shift. That is an incredibly hard way to live. Those families have 3 to 6 times the national divorce rate, and everybody is just stretched and exhausted. In that context, being able to keep mom at home full-time can look pretty darn good.
What do you recommend to Democrats that they wrap all of this stuff into policy that is appealing to not just progressive elitists, as you put it in the book, but also to the white middle class, which really used to be the Democratic support group?
Yeah. I mean, I think if Democrats want an alliance that includes the white working class, they're going to have to center the issues that working class people of all races care about most, and that is access to good jobs. That can entail massive new support for community colleges to work with businesses, to create certificate programs to train people for these important middle skill jobs, and basically bringing Silicon Valley into the act, not in favor of a guaranteed annual income, which, by the way, ain't gonna happen, but to invent the next generation of blue-collar jobs that use interfaces with technology to upskill low-wage jobs, middle-class jobs, so that they can all pay a decent middle-class wage. I think that centering that could recreate this alliance with the white working class, but even more important, that's what non-elite Americans, no matter what their race is, care about, whether they're middle class, formerly middle class, or always poor. That's really what they want.
Thank you so much, author Joan Williams, and thank you for talking about your book, The White Working Class. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay or at To the Contrary. Please visit our PBS website, which is pbs.org/To the Contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next week.